So happy to have you along, as always. We are joined once again by Greg Engert, beer director of the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, a food and wine sommelier of the year. The group including Tallulah, Eat Bar in Arlington, and the coming soon, Blue Jacket down near Nationals Park. That's going to be exciting. We should be getting an update on that pretty soon.
Yeah.
Greg, good to see you.
You too.
What's on tap this week?
So this week we are doing a somewhat new beer from the brewery. The brewery being an amazing small brew house, craft brewery down in Placentia, California, so Southern California. It's called The Bruery, B-R-U-E-R-Y, as a mashup of brewery and Rue, R-U-E, which is Patrick Rue's surname, and he is the founder of the brewery back in 2008. So the brewery is known for a lot of kind of Belgian-inspired beers, but also great barrel-aged beers, lots of sour beers, and with this this new beer called Smoking Wood, we have now a beautifully smoky beer from them as well. So really, really cool. This is the second time they've made this beer. They did it, then released it the first time in 2011, and then now, again, just did it in 2012. So you'll still see some of it out and about on the shelves, and a really great portion of their portfolio because it is very different from some of the other beers that they make. So take a little sip, and then I'll tell you a little bit more.
Yes. Oh, telltale. But inviting, and I think I've told you before, I'm not the biggest fan of smoky beers, but this the nose is very nice.
It's big, a lot of smoke character, but excellent at the same time.
Wow.
Like barbecue.
And I do. Now I want a bowl of barbecue chips.
Yeah, it's like barbecue. Like,
no, that's good. I'm not just saying that. I like that. How do they get that smoke taste? It's not like, they're not dumping a little bottle of liquid smoke like some people do with their hamburger patties.
So, one of the things that's really fascinating about smoky flavors and where smoke comes from in beer is that beer has been being brewed for 8,000 to 10,000 years, And for 99% of its history, most beers would have had a smoky quality to them, which is funny because today I think that, now that sours have become so kind of loved and they seem to be everywhere, the smoke character of a beer seems to be the strangest character of all, but in fact would have been a portion of most beers being made for all of beer's history, largely because when you malt grain to allow your yeast to ferment it, this inevitably involves a heating process. So grain exists as a seed with a starch source that is much too complex for yeast to consume on its own, whereas a grape or an apple or pears have simplified sugars. That's also why they rot so easily, and why grains can be stored for so long and shipped all over the world, and we can brew beer all the time everywhere. So in order to get your starch simplified into sugars, you have to germinate the grain, so you get the grain wet. This gets diastatic enzymes fired that are going to try to slice or begin to slice the starches into simplified sugars. The grain's doing that for itself so it can eat its sugars and sprout. So we have to stop the germination along the way, and this is done by heating. So for most of beer's history, you would have heated the grain during the malting process over whatever your particular fuel source was. So if you're in Scandinavia or the British Isles, where peat is the fuel of choice for most people, you're going to burn your grain during the malting process over peat fires. The grain's going to smell and taste like peat, so if you ferment it and then distill it, you're going to have peaty single malt scotch, something like that. So in this case, the grain bill includes malted barley, some roasted barley, the malted barley giving you the sugars for the fermentation, but also rye malt, which gives it a kind of spicy richness, and most importantly for the flavor, beechwood smoked and cherrywood smoked malt. So beechwood is what has been being used for a very long time in Franconia, northern Bavaria. They burned beechwood.
Budweiser.
That's beechwood aged.
Oh, beechwood aged, okay.
And that's very, very different,
that's
actually. You'll notice Budweiser.
Expert.
You'll notice Budweiser doesn't taste like beechwood smoke. But it is actually beechwood aged for a different reason.
All right, never mind. I said anything.
No, that's funny.
Continue
actually.
Where you were.
So the Franconians have been burning beechwood to dry their grains, and that's why Rauch beers from Franconia, from primarily Bamberg, have such a bacony, spicy, meaty quality like the beers of Spezial and Schlenkerla. So you'll get that here, a little bit of that bacon, spice, and meat.
Oh, yeah.
Cherrywood, on the other hand, is something that wasn't used for fuel burning for a long time because it's rather expensive and useful compared to beechwood, which is brittle. But if you burn cherrywood, you get a little bit more of like a full fruity quality and a smoother, slight sweet note. And I get that a lot in the nose here. And that's why it has a kind of like barbecue flavor of like barbecue, almost like barbecue sauce from the cherrywood, and then the meat beneath coming from the beechwood.
Okay.
And then actually, after that's all said and done, then the beer is brewed, and it is quite strong, over 10% alcohol. It's then aged in rye, whiskey, oak barrels. So that gives a little tannic dryness, a little hit of pop of booze in the finish, which is delicious. So altogether, a very complex and layered and intense experience.
Yeah, again, I'm not a big smoked beer fan, but I really do like this. This would be a great bottle to share with a friend. I can envision a plate, and we talked about this before with a similar beer, of smoked salmon from my native Washington state.
That'd be great.
I had some smoked venison that a friend made over Thanksgiving that was good, that I think would be delicious with this. What else would you recommend?
Texas barbecue.
Okay.
Brisket. Yeah. Then even like, you can, this is almost kind of sauce, so you could just have a kind of a pulled pork. That would be excellent with this too. This would bring in the smoke and it would bring in the seasoning as well. But it is pretty big. So you're going to want to make sure you've got some big fatty notes to it to kind of stand up. I could even actually, just now thinking about it, like really, really fatty pastrami would taste good with this. It would kind of just melt in your mouth. I think it'd be awesome.
And a great beer to try, and we've talked about this before. You should, if you've never had it, try it. And you may not be a huge fan of it, but come to a place like Church Key, get a bottle of this with you and 3 friends, and you're each going to get probably about an 8 ounce.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, it's a 750, 25 ounces or so.
A little bit of a taste. So if you really don't like it, you're not going to let it go to waste, because that's cardinal rule number 1: never let beer go to waste. We have a question for you, Greg, from Jeff Bradley. Jeff writes a nice question that is too long for me to read the whole thing here, but I'll kind of boil it down. He's saying, historically wine has been a sophisticated drink. Beer had been regarded as the drink of the working class, and we know that has changed. He thinks that beer has become the superior beverage. I know there's a lot of people out there who would probably disagree with that, but I also understand. He's curious what you think about the beer-wine comparison and where you see things going from here in people's attitudes toward beer.
Well, I mean, it's actually an interesting question for right now, because I did just start to talk about it. I mean, historically, grapes are grown in fewer areas than grain. So historically, right there, they're much scarcer than grain. And so right there, wine is much scarcer than beer. But at the same time, beer can be made even before refrigeration, could be made in much more of the year than wine. I mean, what fermentation is of grapes into wine is a preservation process, because you harvest your grapes, they need to either be eaten and consumed or fermented into alcohol, or else they are not going to last very long. Grain, on the other hand, because it's filled with complex starch molecules rather than simplified sugars, can be stored and can be kind of utilized for much longer, much beyond the harvest in the fall, to brew up until it got warm in late March, early April. This is before refrigeration. So there was more grain to be had, more time to brew beer. And I think also because of the lack of simplified sugars, even in malted barley, you'd had much kind of lower alcohol beer versus wine, because wine is just so many simplified sugars that yeast can really get the alcohol up. So for all of these reasons, beer was much more available, and wine was much scarcer. So it has always been looked at as kind of more sophisticated. However, what's interesting about this is that it wasn't really until the Middle Ages that wine began to be appreciated in the way that we appreciate it today, like for varietals and terroir and things like that. Before then, it was still viewed as, because it was scarce and because it naturally fermented without any human it wasn't like beer where you'd have to get involved to malt to get the fermentation going. It had a certain godliness to it over beer, and it was scarcer, so it was still loved more than beer. But really, for most of wine's history, it's been pretty nasty to drink, just because if you think about it, without methods of storing and things like that that we have today, wine would quickly turn acidic and vinegary and sour once produced, and so they actually used to have to season wine as we know they season beer, and they would use all sorts of things like pitch, which is boiled sap, to sweeten the wine because it was so sour, or even lead and other ingredients and things like that.
That was a good idea.
Yeah, right. But in any event, yeah, I think the scarcity factors made it a bigger thing, and then coupled with the kind of the French culinary revolution that occurs in the 18th, beginning a little in the 18th, but then 19th and in the 19th century for sure, it became huger. That, of course, also happened at the time when beer went from being kind of local and stylistically different to being industrialized and global. So understand where that is. Now, today, the greatest thing about craft beer is that with the efforts coming in from all the craft brewers all over the world, and people caring about flavor before profit, margin, and efficiency, they are able to produce incredibly complex flavors that I think do rival those of great wine. And they can do it in much larger quantities. So I don't think there's any way to say that beer is better than wine or vice versa, just because I think if they're both well made, they're very different things and both equally amazing. But I will say that really fantastic beer will always be more available and typically less expensive.
Okay. Love beer, love wine, love my iPhone, which allows us to tape these reports. That's all we need. As we get into the early part of the new year, thanks a lot to Jeff Bradley for that question. Hope that helped a bit. If you'd like to ask Greg a question, it's very simple. Send us an email, beeroftheweek@wtop.com. WTOP.com. This is the fourth report after all. I've sampled 4 beers this afternoon. So, Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much. Everyone, please always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.